The sound of the slap echoed through the decorated hall like thunder. 50 guests sat frozen in their seats, watching as Grace stumbled backward, her hand flying to her burning cheek. She was 8 months pregnant, and this was supposed to be her baby shower. Grace had given up everything for love. For 3 years she hid the fact that she was the only daughter of Richard Ademola, the trillionaire boss whose empire controlled banks, real estate, technology, and media across Nigeria. She wanted her husband Michael to love her for who she was, not for her family's wealth. But now, as she stood trembling in the center of the room with divorce papers in her shaking hands, she realized her sacrifice had been for nothing. "Sign the papers, Grace," Michael commanded loudly enough for every guest to hear. His voice was cold and empty of love. "I want this divorce finalized before that baby is born." The 50 guests remained silent. None of them moved to help the pregnant woman whose world was crumbling before their eyes. Grace's hands trembled as she looked down at the legal documents. The words blurred through her tears. She had given up her family's wealth, her father's protection, and her rightful place as heir to a trillionaire empire. But Michael had never known about any of it. She had wanted him to love her for herself alone, not for her money. "Michael, please," Grace whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "Can we talk about this privately? The baby." But before she could finish her sentence, Michael's hand flew through the air and connected with her cheek. The slap was loud and shocking. The gasp that followed from the crowd was even louder. Grace stumbled backward. Her hand flew to her burning face, but she managed to stay on her feet despite the shock radiating through her pregnant body. She could feel her baby kicking inside her belly, as if sensing her mother's distress. "Don't you dare use that baby to manipulate me," Michael snarled with venom dripping from every word. His eyes held no remorse for the violence he had just committed. "I know you trapped me with this pregnancy. But I won't let you ruin my life any longer." From across the room, a sharp laugh pierced through the horrified silence. But it was not a laugh of disbelief or shock. It was a laugh of triumph and victory. Jennifer stepped forward from the shadows. Her designer heels clicked against the marble floor as she moved. The dress she wore had been purchased with money from Michael and Grace's joint account. She was tall, beautiful, and confident, but her eyes held a cruelty that matched the smile spreading across her painted lips. "Finally," Jennifer announced to the room with satisfaction in her voice. Her arms snaked around Michael's waist, but her gaze remained fixed on Grace's tear-stained face. "I've been waiting for months to take my rightful place. This pathetic little housewife just wouldn't let go." Grace's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She had suspected the affair for months, whispered phone calls and late nights at the office. But seeing Jennifer draped over her husband at her own baby shower was a betrayal she could never have prepared for. The other woman's laugh continued to ring through the hall like a cruel mockery of everything Grace had believed about love. But Grace noticed something that neither Michael nor his mistress had spotted. In the corner of the ceiling, a small red light was blinking steadily. The security camera was recording everything that was happening in this room. The humiliation was not over yet. Patricia, Michael's mother, rose from her seat at the head table. Her face twisted with disgust as she looked at Grace. But her anger was not directed at her son for his violence. It was aimed squarely at the pregnant woman trembling in the center of the room. The older woman had never approved of her son's marriage to Grace. She had tolerated her only because she believed the young woman would produce an heir for their family. But now, with the divorce happening, Patricia no longer had any reason to hide her true feelings. "You worthless girl," Patricia hissed as she marched toward Grace. Her finger pointed accusingly at the pregnant woman. Her expensive jewelry glinted under the chandelier lights as she moved closer. "You couldn't even keep my son happy. And you expect us to celebrate your pregnancy?" Grace opened her mouth to defend herself, but Patricia had already grabbed her by the arm. The older woman's grip was surprisingly strong. She began dragging Grace toward the exit while the pregnant woman struggled to keep her balance on the polished floor. "Get out," Patricia commanded as she pulled Grace toward the double doors. "You are no longer welcome in this family. Don't think for a moment that you'll get a single penny from my son." The doors burst open to reveal a heavy rainstorm outside. Dark clouds filled the sky, and rain poured down like tears from heaven. But Patricia showed no mercy. She shoved Grace into the cold, wet darkness without a second thought. Grace stumbled down the steps. Her beautiful dress was immediately soaked through by the rain. She turned back one last time to see Michael watching from the doorway with Jennifer wrapped around him like a snake. Neither of them showed any sign of regret or sympathy. The rain pounded against Grace's skin like 1,000 tiny needles. But the physical cold was nothing compared to the ice that had formed around her broken heart. She stood alone on the wet pavement with her arms wrapped protectively around her swollen belly. Her baby kicked inside her as if sensing her mother's distress. 3 years of marriage had ended in public humiliation. Grace had never imagined that the man she loved would raise his hand against her while she carried his child. Tears mixed with rainwater as they streamed down her face. But then she heard the sound of car doors opening behind her. Grace turned slowly. Rainwater streamed down her face, blurring her vision. But what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. 3 black SUVs had formed a protective semicircle around her in the parking lot. It was the man stepping out of the lead vehicle that made her knees nearly buckle. Richard Ademola stood tall despite his 62 years. His silver hair and tailored suit were already getting soaked as he rushed toward his daughter. His expression mixed rage with heartbreak in a way that made Grace's chest tighten with emotion. "Daddy," Grace whispered. Her voice cracked with emotion. The word felt foreign on her lips after 3 years of pretending she had no family. "How did you?" But Richard did not let her finish. He wrapped his arms around her trembling form and pulled her against his chest. His embrace was warm and protective, everything Grace had missed for the past 3 years. "I've been watching over you every single day, sweetheart," Richard murmured into her wet hair. But his voice carried a dangerous edge that Grace recognized from her childhood. "I had hoped that boy would prove himself worthy of you. But tonight he showed me exactly what kind of man he truly is." Inside the hall, Michael stood at the bar with Jennifer pressed against his side. A champagne glass was in his hand as if celebrating his freedom. His mother Patricia was already moving among the guests, telling stories that painted Grace as a mentally unstable gold digger. But Michael's phone suddenly buzzed with an urgent notification. He glanced down at the screen with mild irritation. Then the color drained from his face as he read the message from his boss. The text was brief but devastating. "Emergency meeting tomorrow morning. Don't be late." What Michael did not know was that his company was owned by Harrington Industries. And Richard Ademola had just made a very important phone call. How would Michael react when he discovered the truth about his poor, quiet wife? The morning sun rose over Lagos like a golden promise of new beginnings. But for Michael, this day would mark the beginning of his complete and utter destruction. He walked into his office building with his usual confident stride. But something felt different today. The receptionist who normally greeted him with a warm smile would not even meet his eyes. The elevator ride to the executive floor felt longer than usual. Michael dismissed his unease as leftover tension from the previous night's events. But nothing could have prepared him for what awaited behind those boardroom doors. 12 executives sat around the polished table. Their expressions ranged from pity to barely concealed satisfaction. But it was the man at the head of the table who made Michael's blood run cold. He had never met Richard Ademola in person. But every business professional in Nigeria knew that face. The trillionaire boss whose empire controlled banks, media companies, technology firms, and real estate holdings worth more than most nations' wealth. "Mr. Michael," Richard said. His voice was smooth but dangerous. "Please have a seat. We have much to discuss." Michael's legs moved mechanically toward the empty chair. But his mind was racing to understand why the most powerful businessman in Nigeria was sitting in his company's boardroom. His hands began to sweat as he sat down. "Mr. Ademola, this is an unexpected honor," Michael stammered. "But I'm not sure why." "You're not sure why I'm here?" Richard interrupted with a cold smile. His eyes held no warmth whatsoever. "Then allow me to enlighten you. But first, I want to show you something." A massive screen on the wall flickered to life. The image that appeared made Michael's heart stop beating. The security footage from the baby shower played in crystal clear definition. It showed him slapping Grace across the face while Jennifer laughed in the background. The video did not stop there. It continued to show Patricia grabbing Grace and throwing her out into the rain. It showed Michael watching with his arm around his mistress, doing nothing to stop his mother or help his pregnant wife. "That woman you struck," Richard continued. His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that filled the silent room, "is my daughter. But I suspect you already figured that out." The color drained from Michael's face like water from a broken vessel. His mouth opened and closed without producing any sound. His mind flashed back to every moment of his marriage. Every time Grace had quietly endured his complaints about money. Every instance where she had hidden her pain behind a gentle smile. Every occasion when she had chosen love over luxury. He had never suspected that his poor wife was the sole heir to a trillionaire empire. "I don't understand," Michael finally managed to stammer. His voice sounded weak even to his own ears. Grace told me she had no family. She never mentioned. She wanted to be loved for who she was, not what she owned. Richard cut him off. Disgust dripped from every syllable he spoke. But you couldn't even manage that simple task. Richard leaned forward. His hands clasped on the table. His posture radiated the controlled power of a predator about to strike. My daughter gave up everything for you. Her inheritance, her family, her rightful place in society. But you repaid her devotion with infidelity and violence. But Richard was not finished delivering his devastating blows. As of this morning, your company is under new management, Richard announced. He gestured to the executives around the table. But that's just the beginning of your problems, Mr. Michael. He slid a folder across the table toward Michael. The younger man's hands trembled too violently to open it properly. Papers spilled onto the table in front of him. Inside that folder, you'll find documentation showing that your mortgage has been called due immediately, Richard explained calmly. Since I now own your bank, I'm afraid no extensions will be granted. Michael's world was crumbling around him like a sandcastle in a tsunami. But the waves of destruction kept coming without mercy or pause. My startup, Michael whispered. Sudden realization was dawning in his eyes. The investors who funded my business. All subsidiaries of Ademila Industries, Richard confirmed with a satisfied nod. I've already instructed them to withdraw their funding, effective immediately. Richard stood from his chair with the grace of a man who had won countless battles. His eyes never left Michael's terrified face. You wanted to divorce my daughter and leave her with nothing. Now you'll understand what nothing truly feels like. Michael's phone buzzed with a notification. The message on his screen made his stomach drop to the floor. Jennifer had sent him a screenshot of her empty bank account along with a single sentence. Your father-in-law froze all my accounts. I'm done with you. Attached to the message was a photo of Jennifer boarding a plane, clearly fleeing from the disaster that Michael had brought upon them both. What would happen to Michael now that he had lost everything? 6 months had passed since the baby shower that destroyed Michael's life. The man who once walked with pride and arrogance now shuffled through the streets of Lagos with the broken posture of someone who had lost everything. His designer suits had been sold to pay legal fees. But the money had barely covered a fraction of his mounting debts. The apartment he now rented was smaller than the closet in his former home. But even this modest dwelling would soon be lost because he could not afford next month's rent. Michael had no job. No company would hire him after the viral video of him slapping a pregnant woman had destroyed his reputation in every industry. His mother Patricia had died during the winter, still cursing Grace's name with her final breath. Jennifer had disappeared to another country and never looked back. But today Michael had swallowed what remained of his pride to do the unthinkable. He stood outside the towering glass building of Ademila Industries. His hands trembled at his sides. The security guards at the entrance recognized him immediately from the photos that had circulated through every department. I need to see Grace, Michael told the receptionist. Desperation cracked his voice into pieces. Please tell her that her ex-husband is here to apologize. The receptionist's eyebrow raised with barely concealed contempt. But she picked up the phone and relayed the message to the executive floor. Michael waited in the marble lobby with his heart pounding against his ribs. Every passing minute felt like an eternity of judgment from the well-dressed employees who whispered and pointed in his direction. Then the elevator doors opened with a soft chime. Grace stepped into the lobby with the commanding presence of a woman who had finally claimed her birthright. The infant cradled in her arms softened the power radiating from her designer outfit. She looked nothing like the timid housewife Michael had married 3 years ago. The transformation went far deeper than her expensive clothes and perfectly styled hair. Her eyes held a strength that had always been there. But Michael had been too blind and too arrogant to recognize it. Michael, Grace acknowledged. Her voice was as cool as winter marble. I must admit, I'm surprised you had the courage to show your face here. Michael dropped to his knees on the polished floor. He had no concern for the spectacle he was creating. His eyes were fixed on the baby girl in Grace's arms. The daughter he had never met. The child he had rejected before she was even born. Please, Grace, I'm begging you, Michael pleaded. Tears streamed down his unshaven face. I've lost everything. My job, my home, my savings. It's all gone. I have nothing left. And whose fault is that? Grace asked. One eyebrow raised in question. But she made no move to help him off the floor. I gave you 3 years of unconditional love. But you repaid me with betrayal and violence. Michael's desperation pushed him to reach for his final card. The only thing he thought might move Grace's heart. The baby, Michael gasped. He pointed at the infant with shaking fingers. She's my daughter too. You can't keep her from me forever. I have rights as her father. He paused and then spoke the words that would seal his fate forever. But I'm willing to sign them away if you'll just help me get back on my feet. Just give me some money and I'll never bother you again. The lobby fell silent. Every employee stopped to witness this pathetic display. But Grace's expression never wavered from its mask of composed indifference. She looked down at the man who had once made her feel worthless. But she felt nothing except a distant pity for how far he had fallen. How small and broken he had become. You want to sell your parental rights for money? Grace repeated. Disgust colored her tone clearly. Her arms tightened protectively around her daughter. That tells me everything I need to know about the kind of father you would have been. Grace had one final truth to deliver. One last message before closing this chapter of her life forever. I never needed your money, Michael, Grace said. She stepped closer to look down at his kneeling form. I wanted your love. I hid my identity because I wanted to build a life based on genuine connection. But you showed me that your love was always conditional on what you could gain. She paused to let her words sink into his broken spirit. Her voice softened slightly with her next sentence. But the softness held no forgiveness, only finality. My daughter will grow up knowing her worth. But she will never know the father who tried to sell her for a financial bailout. What lesson would Grace's daughter learn from her mother's painful journey? Security guards materialized at Michael's sides. They escorted him from the building as he continued to beg and plead. His desperate voice echoed through the marble lobby until the glass doors closed behind him with a finality that matched the emptiness in his chest. Grace had already turned away. She returned to her office without looking back. As the elevator doors closed around her, she allowed herself one small smile of triumph. Not because she had destroyed Michael, but because she had survived him. She had entered her marriage as a trillionaire's daughter pretending to be ordinary. But she emerged as a mother, an executive, and a woman who had finally learned that true love cannot be forced into existence. It must be freely given by those worthy of receiving it. Michael stood outside on the street. The busy Lagos traffic rushed past him as if he did not exist. He had nowhere to go. No one to turn to. His mother was dead. His mistress had abandoned him. His wife had rejected his pleas. And his daughter would never know his name. The man who had once slapped his pregnant wife at her own baby shower now understood the true cost of his cruelty. Some debts can never be repaid. Some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. 5 years passed like pages turning in a book. The autumn leaves danced across the manicured lawn of the Ademola estate like golden whispers of time passing. The little girl chasing them moved with the carefree joy of someone who had never known suffering. Her name was Hope Ademola. At 5 years old, she was already the pride of her grandfather's empire. But more importantly, she was the center of her mother's entire universe. Grace stood on the terrace watching her daughter play. A gentle smile rested on her face. Her thoughts drifted to the journey that had brought her to this moment of peace. 5 years had passed since that terrible night at the baby shower. The scars of betrayal had healed into wisdom that she now wore like armor. She had transformed from a naive young bride into the CEO of Ademola Media Group. But her greatest accomplishment was not her corner office or her powerful position. It was the resilient, compassionate woman she had become. The mother who would teach her daughter to know her own worth. "Mommy, look," Hope called out. She held up a perfectly red leaf in her small hands. Her bright eyes sparkled with joy and innocence. "It's the most beautiful one I've ever found." "It's absolutely perfect, sweetheart," Grace replied. Warmth flooded her voice like sunshine. But she noticed her father approaching from the house with an envelope in his weathered hands. Richard Ademola had aged gracefully over the past 5 years. But the fire in his eyes had never dimmed, especially when it came to protecting his daughter and granddaughter. The envelope he carried would bring news from an unexpected source. "This arrived for you today," Richard said. He handed the letter to Grace. His expression revealed that he already knew its contents. "It's from Michael. But you don't have to read it if you'd prefer not to." Grace took the envelope with steady hands. Hands that no longer trembled at the mention of her ex-husband's name. But curiosity compelled her to break the seal and unfold the single page inside. The handwriting was shaky and desperate. The words painted a picture of a man who had finally reached rock bottom. But Michael's letter was not a plea for money this time. Grace read silently to herself. Each sentence revealed the depth of his transformation through suffering. Michael wrote from a homeless shelter in Abuja. He was not asking for her help or her forgiveness. He confessed that 5 years ago, he had destroyed the most precious gift he had ever been given. He was too blind to see her worth until he lost everything. The moment he slapped her while she carried their daughter haunted him every night when he closed his eyes. He wrote about how Jennifer had abandoned him the moment Richard took away her comfortable life. How his mother had blamed him for their family's downfall until her dying breath. How he had spent 5 years learning what it meant to have nothing. The letter's conclusion carried an unexpected confession. Michael finally understood the treasure he had thrown away. Grace had loved him without conditions. But he repaid her with cruelty and betrayal. He did not deserve her forgiveness. But he wanted her to know that he was truly sorry. Not because he lost her father's money, but because he lost the woman who would have loved him through poverty or wealth. His final request was simple. Please tell Hope that her father was once a monster. But even monsters can learn to feel remorse. What would Grace do with this letter from the man who had destroyed her? Grace folded the letter carefully. She slipped it back into the envelope with slow, deliberate movements. But she felt no satisfaction or vindication from Michael's suffering. She had learned long ago that revenge was a poison that destroyed the vessel carrying it. But she had also discovered that forgiveness was not the same as reconciliation. Some people could be forgiven from a distance. Some relationships were meant to stay broken for the protection of those who survived them. What will you do? Richard asked. He watched his daughter's contemplative expression with concern and curiosity. But he already knew that Grace's heart was too kind for permanent hatred. Grace's answer surprised even herself. The words came from a place of peace she had worked years to find. I will pray that he finds peace, Grace said. She turned to watch Hope gather more leaves in her tiny hands. The sight of her daughter's innocent joy anchored her to what truly mattered. But I will also teach my daughter that some bridges must remain burned for our protection. She leaned against her father's shoulder. Gratitude swelled in her chest like a warm tide washing over old wounds. Her eyes remained fixed on the little girl who represented everything good that had emerged from her darkest chapter. Michael taught me that not everyone deserves access to our hearts, Grace continued softly. Her voice carried the wisdom of someone who had learned through pain. But he also showed me the kind of mother I needed to become. Richard nodded with understanding and pride filling his aged eyes. His daughter had been tested by fire and emerged as pure gold. She had learned the hardest lessons life could teach, and she had survived with her kindness intact. Hope came running toward them with her small legs carrying her across the green lawn. Her arms were full of autumn treasures, leaves of red, gold, and orange clutched against her chest. Her laughter rang across the estate like bells announcing a new season of joy and peace. Grace knelt down as her daughter reached her. She opened her arms wide to embrace the little girl who had given her purpose during the darkest days. Hope crashed into her mother's embrace with the fearless trust of a child who had only known love. Look at all my treasures, Mommy, Hope exclaimed. Her eyes sparkled with the same intensity that Grace remembered seeing in her own father's gaze. Can we keep them forever? We can press them in a book, my darling, Grace replied. She smoothed her daughter's hair with gentle fingers. They'll stay beautiful for years and years. As Grace held her daughter close, she finally understood the complete truth of her journey. Her story had never been about revenge or wealth or even justice. It had been about discovering that her true worth had never depended on anyone's recognition except her own. Michael had tried to break her. He had slapped her while she carried his child. He had humiliated her in front of 50 witnesses. He had betrayed her trust and mocked her love. But in doing so, he had inadvertently freed her from the chains of seeking validation from the wrong sources. Grace stood up, lifting Hope into her arms. The little girl rested her head on her mother's shoulder with complete trust and contentment. Richard watched them with misty eyes, seeing the strength of 3 generations of Ademla blood standing before him. Come, let's go inside, Grace said to her daughter. We'll make something beautiful with your treasures. As they walked toward the house, Grace reflected on the letter still clutched in her father's hand. Michael's words of remorse had come too late. Not because she was unwilling to forgive, but because some actions created consequences that could never be undone. He had lost the opportunity to know his daughter. He had destroyed the love of a woman who would have stood by him through anything. He had traded a priceless treasure for temporary pleasures that had abandoned him the moment times grew difficult. But Grace harbored no bitterness. She had learned that carrying hatred was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Instead, she chose peace. She chose to focus on the beautiful life she was building with her daughter. Hope would grow up knowing her worth. She would be taught that patience should never be mistaken for weakness. That the quiet ones are often the most dangerous to betray. That true strength comes from knowing when to hold on and when to let go. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon. Long shadows stretched across the manicured lawn like fingers reaching toward tomorrow. Grace paused at the doorway to look back at the place where she had stood just moments before. That spot represented her past. The pain, the betrayal, the humiliation. But she was no longer standing there. She had moved forward. She had grown. She had transformed from a victim into a victor, not through revenge but through resilience. "Mommy, why are you smiling?" Hope asked. She looked up at her mother with curious innocence. "Because I'm happy, sweetheart," Grace replied. And it was true. Despite everything she had endured, or perhaps because of it, she had found genuine happiness. "I'm happy because I have you and Grandpa and a life filled with love." "I'm happy too," Hope declared with the simple wisdom of childhood. "Can we have ice cream after we press the leaves?" Grace laughed, the sound light and free. "Yes, my darling. We can have ice cream." As they disappeared into the warmth of their home, the autumn leaves continued their gentle dance outside. Some storms come to destroy us, Grace had learned. But the strongest souls learn to dance in the rain and then teach their daughters to do the same. That was her legacy. Not the billions she would inherit or the empire she would run, but the lesson she would pass to her daughter. That true worth comes from within, that love should never require you to diminish yourself, and that sometimes the greatest victory is simply refusing to let cruelty break your spirit. Grace had won not by destroying Michael, but by refusing to let his actions destroy her. And in the end, that made all the difference. We've come to the end of today's story. I hope it touched your heart. Thanks for watching and staying with us till the end. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. See you in the next one. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from?